Hello and welcome to the Tank Club. This is my HYPR Sorc 1-bar ice staff tank build for the High Isle patch. I hope you enjoy the build. Just a little disclaimer that this is not intended for that top level content, those DLC hard mode dungeons, those trifecta trials, vet trials, that kind of thing. This is designed for casual, fun, easy play with a 1-bar setup. So I hope you enjoy the build. Let's get into it. So firstly, the race for this build, I have chosen an Orc. If you've watched my previous content, you'll know that race doesn't make a huge impact when it comes to tanking. But in this situation, I've chosen the Orc, and the reason for that is I wanted to go for the max stamina, the nice max health, the extra little heal, and then the movement speed, which is a really nice feature. In terms of the attributes, we've got 15 into Magicka, 11 into health, and 38 into stamina. As you can see here, I've got those base stats that I like to aim for. That 21k Magicka, the 38k health, and the 27k stamina. When it comes to our recovery, if we buff up and use a potion, our Magicka recovery is 2,800. Which is a really nice amount. We want to have as much Magicka recovery as possible. That's going to help us to sustain our stamina because we are on a sorcerer tank. For our resistances, we've got 26k spell, 25.3k physical resistance. That is going to be more than enough for what we need to get through on this build. Again, if you've seen my previous videos about resistances and block mitigation, you'll see that that is going to be more than enough to help us get through content. Just a quick look at our advanced stats, and we've got a 812 block cost, and we've got a 68% block mitigation. For the Mundus stone, we are using the Atronach Mundus stone for the extra Magicka recovery. That's really essential, and obviously combined with our buffed up Magicka recovery, that's how we were able to get to 2,800, is by using the Atronach, along with being a sorcerer, the passives, the champion points, and all those kinds of things. Okay, for our consumables, firstly food, but with sugar skulls, we're using this to increase our max stats as high as we can. And for the potions, your standard tri-stat potions that give all resources and all recoveries. That's really, really important as well. Okay, so we've got two different options for the gear here. We've got one with a mythic item and one with a different mythic or without a mythic as well. So you've got a few things that you can change to benefit yourself and make sure you're reaching your own needs as a tank. So first of all, this is obviously a 1-bar build. So for the 1-bar, we are using a Yolnacrin Ice Staff. And the reason why we're using it in this particular trait, so we're using Charged, and we're also using Absorb Stamina for the enchant. Now the reason for this is I'm not using an Infused Crusher, because the Infused Crusher provides a debuff to the enemy that reduces their resistances, which increases your group's damage. However, so does using a charged Absorb Stamina. This is going to provide Minor Breach, which is more of a pen value than an Infused Crusher. So I decided to go with this instead, so that we're able to provide that increased pen. It's causing the Sundered status effect, which then applies Minor Breach. That is how it works. So we're using Absorb Stamina. We're going to get stamina back as well, which is really nice. So it's going to help us with our sustain. And then we are proccing that Minor Breach via the Sundered effect, which gets applied by physical damage. Because we're using a charged weapon, it procs every single time. So without fail, we get the Sundered effect every time. We get the Minor Breach every time. So this is very, very good. Next, I'm using a Magma Incarnate One Piece. And I'm using this because we're going to get the Magicka recovery and the stamina recovery, which are some nice one-piece perks that we can get there. The next gear set I'm using is the Turning Tide gear set. This is just too strong not to use it for any kind of content, really. When we look at this, we get max health, we get max stamina, we get more max health, so plenty of tank stat benefits there. When you block, you gain flowing water for 10 seconds, causing your next bash attack to deal magic damage to up to 6 enemies in a 5x10 meter line and applying major vulnerability for 10 seconds. Increasing the damage that enemies take by 10%, and it can occur once every 15 seconds. So the reason why we're using this is because every single ad pull, we're going to have major vulnerability. It's the same as having the Necromancer's Colossus Ultimate, but on every single ad pull. when we then get to a boss fight, we don't have methods of maintaining a better uptime than 66% because we're not using Nazare, but we are going to get a really nice 66.66% uptime on a boss fight if you proc it on cooldown, which is a lot. It's a lot of increased damage for your group. So we are using the Turning Tide gear set because it's just too good not to. As I mentioned before, we're using the Yolnahkriin set as well, and we're using this because we get a nice max health there. We get minor Aegis, which is going to reduce the damage that we take by 5%. We then get max stamina. For the perfected gear, we get another max health right there, but you don't have to use the perfected if you don't have it. And then finally, when you taunt an enemy, you give yourself and 11 group members minor courage, which increases your weapon and spell damage. And the reason why, again, I'm using this gear set is it's going to proc automatically. It's providing you with some nice stats and reduced damage. But we're giving our group minor courage with virtually no effort. We're just going to taunt like we would do anyway, and we're providing a buff. One of the easiest to use sets in the game. And the final piece of gear that I'm using on this build is the Oaken Soul Ring. Now, the reason we use this is because it prevents you from actually bar swapping. So because we're using a one bar setup, we don't want to accidentally switch bar. Especially if you're using a controller or something like that, you can accidentally switch bar. If you've only got one weapon equipped, you're going to be equipping to your fists. You might not have any skill slotted on your back bar, so then you're going to have problems with that as well. So this forcefully keeps you on your primary bar. So that's the nice perk of using it for a one bar setup. The fact that we've only got one bar limits our opportunities with skills as well. So we're able to get a bunch of different buffs that we wouldn't be able to get because we don't have the bar space. So here we get Major Berserk, Major Courage, Major Brutality, Major Sorcery, Major Prophecy, Major Savagery, Major Force, Major Protection, Major Resolve, Minor Fortitude, Minor Intellect, Minor Endurance, and Major Heroism. Now the ones that we mainly focus on here are the Major Protection. That's going to reduce our incoming damage received by 10%. Major Resolve is going to give us nearly 6,000 resistances. And Major Heroism is going to give us lots and lots of ultimate back every 1.5 seconds. We also get the Minor Intellect, which gives us more Magicka recovery. The Minor Fortitude gives us more health recovery. The other things are not that valuable, but by having all these increased damage buffs and increased weapon damage buffs, we're able to do more healing. So if we didn't have access to these buffs, our incoming healing would be much lower. Now, if you didn't want to use the Oaken Soul Ring, you could use a monster set instead. So you could equip a Yolnahkriin ring to go there, and then this means that you don't need the Yolnahkriin piece on the shoulder. Now you could use the Spulder of Ruin in this situation to provide your group with even more damage. So if you want to play a less kind of selfish version of this build, you could do Spulder of Ruin instead. You could also use a different monster. You could use Nazare. You could use Engine Guardian if you really struggle for sustain with this build. Or you can work things in whichever way you like. For the gear, I have gone with Turning Tide on the chest, the waist, the hands, the legs, and the feet, so that we have 5 heavy pieces there. We then have a heavy piece on the shoulder because Yolnahkriin is heavy. And then the light helmet. I've gone with light instead of medium because I wanted to get a little bit more benefit from the magic side of things. And that is why I went with that. For the Yolnahkriin gear, we're on the neck, the ring, the shoulder, and the staff. That gives us the 5-piece. For the jewelry traits, I'm infused Magicka recovery. I'm trying to boost my sustain as high as possible. So I've gone 3 infused Magicka recovery. If you wanted to, you could put a stamina cost reduction in there because you're going to potentially need it for that silver leash. You could use a Magicka cost reduction in there as well if you wanted to. You could use Trine jewelry if you wanted even higher stats. On all of the body pieces, I've gone with that sturdy tri-stat combination. It's flawless. It's my favourite combination. You don't have to do that, like I say. You can adjust your attributes and your enchants whichever way you like, whichever way works best for you, and whichever way works best for your race. So just make sure you're hitting some base value stats and adjust these accordingly. But sturdy is really vital for this build because you don't have the option of heavy attacking to get stamina back. You don't want to be having a really high block cost. Okay, next we're going on to the skills. And first skill, we have got Frost Clench. This is our taunt skill. Now, if you don't have enough range from this has only got a 15 meter range, which is not far. You can use Inner Fire instead. But this one is the better morph because it offers a lot more to yourself and your group. So by using Frost Clench, you're going to cause frost damage. You're going to cause the chilled effect. You're going to taunt the enemy. You're going to apply Major Maim. By applying the chilled effect, this is also going to provide Minor Brittle, which means the enemy takes 10% more damage. And you're also going to apply Minor Maim, which reduces damage by 5%. So we've got Major and Minor Maim, so in total we're going to be reducing the enemy's damage by 15%. This is also an immobilization skill, so what you're going to want to do is when you chain in an enemy, so you're going to use your chains in an ad pull, and then you're going to want to use Frost Clench to immobilize them. So this is your crowd control as well. It's not ideal, because obviously crowd control usually wants to be some kind of AoE type of crowd control, but we're very limited on bar space with a 1-bar build, so we are using this for our crowd control as well. Next we've got Elemental Drain, and we have to use this because we don't have any Major Breach. Major Breach is really, really important. If we're not applying Major Breach to an enemy, we've got huge problems because we're not able to provide enough pen for enemies to die fast enough. So we apply Elemental Drain. It applies Major Breach. The skill is free, which is one of the perks to using it. It also applies Minor Magicka Steel, which means we're going to get Magicka back. So when we put down any type of damage on the enemy and we've got Minor Magicka Steel active on them, when we cause damage, we're going to get Magicka back. So that's nice for generating a bit of Magicka sustain as well. For ad pulls, if you wanted to, Major Breach is still important for ad pulls, but you could switch this out for Razor Caltrops. So if you wanted to try and make this more effective, you could use Razor Caltrops on ads. That's going to apply Area of Effect Major Breach, and it's going to apply a snare, which is going to make the enemies move slower when they're stood inside it. So this could be the better option for ad pulls instead of Elemental Drain, but then you'll use the Elemental Drain when you get to those boss fights. The next skill we've got is Dark Deal. This is why we want to have as much Magicka recovery as possible, because we're going to use this skill to give ourselves a heal, to get stamina back, so 3,600 stamina instantly, and an additional 2,400 stamina over 20 seconds. So by using this skill, we're giving ourselves resources back. But it's not just resources, it's not just a burst of resources, it's those resources over time that are going to be really, really helpful while we're blocking. When we're not blocking, when we would go and do a heavy after a heavy, that is when you cast this skill. So when you cast Dark Deal, you drop block. That's going to cause you to die in situations if you cast it at the wrong time. However, if you use the age-old heavy after a heavy thought process for gaining resources back, use Dark Deal in that moment, because you're not using a one-handed shield, but you can use Dark Deal in that moment instead, and that means you're going to get a burst of stamina, but that stamina over time is super helpful as well. Don't forget, every time you cast your skills, you're also going to be getting stamina back from your enchant on your one hand. So when you cast Frost Clench, that's also going to proc your enchant, which is also going to provide you with stamina. With Dark Deal, we also get the benefits of providing a group buff, so the Exploitation passive will proc. Because you've cast a Dark Magic ability, this is going to give Minor Prophecy to you and your group, which is a nice little group buff. Next, we've got the Unstable Clan Fear. This is a skill that I'm using for safety reasons. So, in theory, you could use Dark Deal for a heal. However, this will drop your block. So if you need an emergency heal and you need to maintain block, this isn't going to really do the trick. You're going to get an 8k heal, but you are going to drop your block. It's forcefully going to make you drop block for 1 second. With Clan Fear, you're able to cast this while blocking. So obviously, it's a burst heal, and it's one of the best burst heals in the game for tanks, because it scales with max health, but because we're using the Oaken Soul Ring and we have a ton of different buffs, this is actually going to heal us for 12,400. That's non-crit. It's actually going to heal for more. If I actually cast this, so here we go, look, it's 13,442. And our pet's getting a heal as well. If it crits, we get a 20,000 heal. So yeah, this is a great healing skill. It's also going to cause some damage to the enemy, so it's a bit of damage. So it makes things a little bit easier, especially in like solo situations. This is going to help with a bit of damage. So this is just a super, super good heal. The next skill is Silver Leash. We have to have some kind of crowd control, but this is also a flex slot. So we have to pull enemies in. So when we go into a dungeon, we have to chain enemies to us. So we use Silver Leash to do that. If you don't need to chain any enemies, you would use something else, because this is just ineffective. If you're not really needing to chain anything, it's a waste of a bar space. So in a situation where we don't need this, we could potentially use Bound Aegis, which would give us increased block mitigation when we cast it. It's also going to give us max magicka for having it slotted, and minor resolve, which is going to give us another 3k resistances. There are a range of other skills we could use. Destruction Staff skill line, we could use Crushing Shock if we need a ranged interrupt. You could use Elemental Blockade if you want some more consistency with your enchant procking. So when we're not needing to use Silver Leash, you could use Elemental Blockade, because then we're going to have our enchant active 100% of the time. You could also potentially use Pulsar if you want to do Area of Effect, Minor Mangle. If you want to do Minor Protection, you want to do that Area of Effect, Minor Brittle, Minor Maim, all those kinds of things. You can use this skill for activating that. Another useful skill would be Equilibrium, and probably the Spell Symmetry morph, because we already have Major Resolve from our Oaken Soul Ring, so you could go with Spell Symmetry if you're struggling for magicka recovery, especially on boss fights. There are situations where you might need Efficient Purge as well, to purge negative effects off your character. And the very last skill is Aggressive Horn. This is going to give us increased max stats, so max magicka and max stamina increased by 10%. It's also going to provide our group with Major Force, increasing their crit damage by 20%. This is the best ultimate in the game, really, for group content, and that is why we would use this. So we're just going to quickly scroll through all the passives that you need for this build. So in your Dark Magic passives, you can take them all, but generally you take Unholy Knowledge, Persistence, and Exploitation. You don't really need Blood Magic. Daedric Summoning, it's worth taking all of these passives: Rebate, Power Stone, Daedric Protection, and Expert Summoner. All useful for this build. Storm Calling, again, you can take them all. You don't need to take Energized, you don't need to take Amplitude, and you don't need to take Expert Mage, but you can if you want to for the increased damage. For the Destruction Staff passives, you do not want to use the Trifocus passive. So, while an Ice Staff is equipped blocking cost magicka instead of stamina, we do not want that. We want to be blocking with stamina with this build, because we're using Dark Deal to gain stamina back and provide that group buff. We do not want to be blocking with magicka, because we will not be able to sustain. We'll have to slot balance on this build to be able to sustain magicka, and there's just not enough bar space to do that. So we are slotting Dark Deal for the group buff, we're slotting Dark Deal for the stamina sustain, we're blocking with stamina, and we're using our magicka for skill casting. For the other ones, you can take Penetrate Magic, but you don't absolutely need to. But then you do want to take Elemental Force. You do want to take Ancient Knowledge, because this is what turns your Ice Staff into a tank weapon. Equipping an Ice Staff reduces the cost of blocking by 36% and increases the amount of damage you can block by 20%. This is what makes it a tank weapon. And then Destruction Expert is a bit of a sustained benefit if you meet those requirements. Light Armor passives, you can take the first 3. You can take them all if you want to, but the first 3 are the important ones. We're not wearing any medium armor, but if we were, we'd take the first 2 and the last one. And then your heavy armor passives, obviously you take all of your passives for your heavy armor, because we are using 6 heavy. You will need your Undaunted passives, your Undaunted Command, your Undaunted Metal, and then finally you do want your racial passives as well. If you are using skills like Purge, then obviously you'll need things like Magicka Aid. If you did end up using Spell Symmetry, then you want to take your Mage's Guild passives. So just have a little think, what if you're using skills in a skill line, then take the passives to go alongside it as well. Okay, and finally onto the champion points. So for the green CP, we just want to slot Rationer, we want to slot Liquid Efficiency and Steed's Blessing, and then whatever else you want to use, it's up to you. On the blue CP, you want to make sure you pick up everything here: Hardy, Preparation, Elemental Aegis. And then you want to take the Ironclad CP. For the slottables, you also want to take Duelist Rebuff, Enduring Resolve, Bulwark, and Unassailable. You want to take all of those. And then what you do is, if you're in a fight where there's no AoE attacks, you slot Bulwark instead. If you find yourself in a fight where there's no damage over time, then you remove Enduring Resolve and make sure you use Bulwark and Unassailable. If you're in a fight where there's no AoE or dot attacks, then you could also slot Cutting Defense to proc your enchant on cooldown when the enemy hits you. So that would be another good option as well. For the red CP, I've got Fortified. I've got Expert Evasion for that free dodge roll. I've got some Sustained by Suffering. And then it's kind of like a flex CP. So in ad pulls, I like to use Celerity for ad pulls. And then when I switch to a boss fight, I like to use Bracing Anchor. You can switch it around if you want. If you want to just keep one setup, Bracing Anchor is probably the better one, but the movement speed will be really, really helpful. You want to take everything here that you don't need to slot, so your Fortification, your Tireless Guardian, things like Hero's Vigor, things like Tumbling and Sprinter, Defiance. You want to take all of those. You could also use Rejuvenation if you want some more consistency with those resources instead of Sustained by Suffering. You could take Slippery if you want that free break free that's also going to automatically break you free once every 21 seconds. That's another option. And that is everything for the red CP. So that is everything for this tank build. This was the HYPR Sorc Ice Staff 1 bar tank build for the High Isle patch. Thank you to everyone who supports the Tank Club on Patreon, on YouTube, on Twitch, everywhere. I appreciate the support very much. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.